Tada Hozumi, welcome to the Plant Yourself podcast.
Hi, hello. How you doing?
I'm doing good. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. As we were just chatting before I hit record, you have done a lot of writing that I have found incredibly helpful, and a lot of it has been very challenging. And
Okay,
so,
that's interesting.
so like this podcast is basically the theme is basically people I want to have conversations with to help me get my head out of my ass, and so that's what I'm going for here. So first, can you just introduce yourself? Just maybe create some context for the conversation.
Yeah, so my name is Tada Hozumi. I'm a what people call a hyphenated Canadian, so Japanese Canadian. Um, I'm kind of like a in between the first like landed in yeah first generation and zero generation, kind of float in between in terms of my identity. Um, yeah, I live and work on what's commonly referred to as unceded coast/territory, so that's also known as Vancouver, BC. And yeah, happy to join everybody here. I'm a somatics practitioner, and also within that, I would say I'm a practitioner of something that I refer to as cultural somatics, and maybe we're probably going to get to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I hope
Yeah.
so.
hmm
Yeah. Let's start with just with somatics. So, like,
Sure.
what does that mean?
Yeah, on a baseline level, that just means of the body. So, all the practices that are kind of based in mindfulness and other disciplines would be kind of just like a part of that. Actually, Howard, I was going to ask, do you hear like a residual noise on my end?
I don't.
Because I can actually close my window to
Oh,
reduce.
when you're not talking, I hear nothing. So it's a very clean signal from my end.
Okay, great. Okay, that's all I need to know. Okay,
Okay.
great. hmm yeah, so somatics just means of the body, and then so a lot of that work you might know as like things like Hakomi method or Feldenkrais or somatic experiencing and modalities like that. I guess technically yoga and a lot of
Mhm.
mindfulness will fall into somatics as well. So that's kind of like the terrain I walk in, and specifically around that. Yeah, cultural somatics is a kind of what you might call, quote unquote, a new offshoot or movement or whatever,
Mhm.
new developments within that field. So the way you might describe that is somatics is really um, working with individuals. Cultural somatics is about seeing groups of people, so collectives as bodies, and working with that as bodies. So that's cultural somatics. So you might, if people are familiar with like social permaculture, I think it's very similar to that idea. So in a
I'm
cultural,
not familiar with social permaculture, and
okay, yeah.
I have a PDC degree. So,
Oh, okay, yeah, yeah. So I guess social permaculture is the idea of working with society using working with groups of people using the kind of principles of permaculture. And so very similarly, like you can work with groups of people using the principles of somatics, and we might call that cultural somatics. Yeah.
okay. And just to dive a little bit farther into somatics straight before we branch out. So this is like what sorts of things happen when people engage in somatics? Like what are some of the goals? Like why do we do
Right,
these
right.
things?
Well, yeah, I think one is like integration of so a lot of like Western psychotherapy has traditionally kind of been like top down, so mind over matter, if that makes sense. A lot of what we call psychoanalysis and CBT and stuff like is that kind of that strain. So it's a top down approach to our healing and change process, whereas somatics you're working with kind of a bottom up. So when you have subtle changes in the body, you're experiencing like yeah shifts within, like you might not even be able to name them. You know what I mean? You might have these subtle processes in the body, and that actually changes how you interact with the world, if that makes sense. So like for example, like I guess like in Japanese somatics in particular, we work a lot with like this idea of how your posture informs how you see the world.
Mm.
So if let's say you're your body's weight is going into the back of your body versus the front of your body, you're going to be activating a different part of your brain, and then your perception of the world changes because of that, right? If that makes sense. Like you might have more back brain action versus, let's say, frontal lobe, or the qualities of that might change. Or if your chest is caved in, you might relate to the world in a different way. Or if your pelvis is tucked away in fear, like you're going to have, or there's a lot of rigidity around your pelvis, you're going to interact with the world with a lot of kind of like a shame kind of based kind of perspective.
So these postures that might be locked into your body for whatever reason, whether it was a past trauma or an accident or habituation, that they actually inform our thinking. And so if I'm going to do CBT, it's going to, cognitive behavioral, if I'm just attacking the thinking and saying, well, man, you're thinking about this wrong, you have a dysfunctional thought, but if the thought arises from the posture itself, then that's going to be a fruitless effort if we don't get at the source. Is that sort of an understanding?
Yeah, that's a part of it. And also, like, sometimes when we change the thought, we have an embodied shift, So when we hear something that makes sense for us, our body shifts to accept that or not accept that. You know what I mean? Like even whatever you call CBT, it's still a somatic process underneath it all. But the orientation is different in the sense that, the vagus nerve, which runs up and down your spine, that connects kind of your entire nervous system to your brain. Like 80% of the information goes upwards. You know what I mean? But we tend to think it's the other way around. So, information is going up, but it's not like 20% is coming down. There's a lot that happens independently of the mind or the mind brain. So that's an important thing. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So somatics, rather than trying to replace CBT, is just saying if 80% of the information is afferent, then maybe we should pay attention to the source of that and acknowledge it directly.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, I'm not going to. I've never done CBT, and I've never seen a CBT therapist, so I can't really say on that. But, I think it's just pretty obvious that, like, our entire society is run off this idea that information mostly travels downward, right? If you look at how our social structures are created and everything, it's embodied everywhere, right? So, it's a lot of it's about shifting the ratio. You know what I mean? It's about institutionalism and all that stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, well,
that's the cultural somatic perspective.
To give an example, a business partner of mine was in a car accident and got trapped behind the steering wheel, wouldn't open, engine block burst into flames, and after that he developed, PTSD around, claustrophobia. Couldn't be in a movie theater, and the cognitive attempts to get him to heal were, "You're safe here." Right.
Yeah.
And what the effect that had, given that his nervous system was telling him that he was about to die when he sat down in the movie theater and the lights went out, was to actually make him crazier.
Yeah.
Right. Now that I know that my thinking is faulty, why can't I stop thinking it? It was only when he began doing like somatic experiencing, the Peter Levine work, did he have access to something that was more compassionate than your thoughts are wrong, so fix them.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, exactly. And it's just that, like, there's a lot of stuff in our body that's a lot more stubborn than you're thinking the wrong way. And that's probably 90% of it. So it runs into problems eventually, after you clear the first 10%, you're like, wait a second. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And I'm so much better at lying with my words than with my physicality.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, 100%.
So I remember when I first started doing a body-based therapy, one of the things I warned my therapist about is like, I'm really clever. I will try to fool you. Like, and she's like, don't worry, sweetie.
Oh, really? That's funny.
Yeah. She's like, I'm not really listening to your bullshit words anyway.
Right. Yeah. Tracking your affect and stuff. Yeah. And inflection. Yeah. Absolutely.
Okay. So I think I sort of have a sense of what you mean by somatics, and I hope that the listeners kind of have a general sense of sort of working with the body for healing, for actualization, for getting what we want, having the experiences we want out of life, and acting in accord with our values and priorities. Now you add another level of cultural somatics. So does that have to do with, like, all of us have bodies that have been shaped by our experiences, and somatics typically looks at it as an individual. Like, you grew up
Yeah.
here, your dad
Yeah.
hit you when you were 12, you got yelled at crossing the street when you were 4, and these are all like patterns. And cultural says that there's bigger things that might be invisible to someone who's just looking at an individual.
Yeah, like I think that's one thing. That's like so for a while we've been talking a little bit about, when first, especially like in the, white Western psychotherapeutic world, they're looking at trauma as an individual kind of experience, and then they maybe enlarge that to family.
Mm.
But where, it's been slower, and for obvious reasons, is to look at the cultural effects of, like, cultural as a a producer of complex trauma for us. So that's like complex trauma is the kind of trauma that when you have like constant exposure to something, as opposed to like a car accident, which is an acute incident. Most of the trauma that we have is actually complex. It's not the acute time. It's like kind of like being around a neglectful parent for 10 years. This is a lot more what we have, right? So cultural trauma is like all that stuff, like the kind of like what happens when we are used to living in a culture that's shitty for us, basically. So that conversation had been going on, I think, for a bit, like, and that's been a big critique that especially like, people of color had when they're working in the, Western, therapeutic institution, because they're like, well, like, our lives need to take into more consideration than just family and individual trauma experiences, right? There's a cultural layer to racism and things like that, as well as like misogyny and, so essentially, yeah, there's like a lot more marginalized people who are doing healing work, and that's actually the majority of us, because, it's probably rare. It's actually like men are actually quite rare in our field, right? And especially in the body-based work, it's actually mostly women who, women and femmes and people who are essentially not cis men doing the work. At least my colleagues are mostly, not men, not cis men at least. And so, and then, yeah, so that's kind of like been the conversation. But cultural somatics for me, in the particular way I approach it is a little bit more than that. There's like a layer of, so yes, there's, like, you could, like, if these systemic oppressions and stuff cause our bodies to experience trauma, cultural somatics starts to go towards like, okay, well, actually, as collections of individuals, we are one body, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, we are one body, and that body has trauma. And that's a little bit different to say than individuals experience this cultural trauma. That's also true. But then there's this another layer of like, no, like our entire culture and society has a body, has a networked body, and it experiences trauma. And a lot, and we see the results of that trauma. Like, for example, like, there was that young white guy who shot a bunch of protesters, right? Like,
Yeah.
bringing guns to a rally and shooting people. That's like we tend to think of that as an individual or even kind of like social experience. But it's like, I think it's actually a lot more than that. There is actually a cultural body that has pain in it and has a very certain ways of expressing it. So yeah, it's a little bit, it's kind of like, yeah, it's a little bit cybernetics, you know what I mean? That's kind of the flavor, I don't know.
Right.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
let me poke at it, see if I can
Sure.
understand it. So when you say that cultures can have trauma, are you talking about, let's say, how you would be treated by the broader culture, so as sort of as an other, or are you talking about like the trauma that I would get from growing up in a culture? Like, I grew up in a Jewish culture that was
Right.
very Holocaust aware, because my mother had escaped.
Yes.
Right. So
Right.
there, I felt the effects of, like, being Jewish. Like it wasn't like anti-Semitism affected me. It was my parents and grandparents affected me.
Yeah. So that's the intergenerational trauma piece, right? Yeah, absolutely. And so like um, and just to say that cultural somatics is not like something that I exclusively do or anything like that. There's a whole bunch of people, other people like you might know are like Resma Menakem. He's a black somatic therapist, and
Uh-huh.
he's done a fair amount of writing and speaking on the subject. But it's specifically more about my approach to it is that like, but yeah, his book's called My Grandmother's Hands. It's been quite popular in the last little while for the obvious reasons. But yeah, so just to say, cultural somatics isn't something like only I represent, or you know what I mean.
Right.
But what I would say is that like, so yes, so you so there's that intergenerational, and that's one layer, right? That's bigger than just Howard layer, right? And now you're getting into the intergenerational. Oh, I have trauma not just from anti-Semitism, from being Jewish, like inheriting your family's lineage of all the anti-Semitic stuff they experience, which is anti-Semitism plus something else, right?
Right.
And I guess like what I'm saying is there's also something else beyond that as well. And that is to say that there is actually a body of all the Jewish people that have been alive up till now and are still alive. That is actually also one body. So it's kind of like the way you might experience that is like what Jung called the collective unconscious,
Uh-huh.
right? Imagine the collective unconscious actually has a body and a nervous system. That's what cultural somatics works with.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, which is to say that I can reject it all I want, but I'm still part of that body.
Yeah. Like and you see this experience. It leaks into it. Those images and things leak into our experience, right? Like, so this is kind of a bit dark, but like, so I think folks know Ted Bundy. So Ted is a very interesting character actually, like this, because when you ask him about his motivations for for his slaying of women and stuff, he said, I get images in my head. And so he really externalizes the stimulus. He's like, this is coming in and it's become this obsession, but it's external to me, these invasive images of women. And something that people don't discuss in the context of discussing Ted Bundy's behavior is that what were Western governments doing about 100 years ago en masse? Is like torturing women in the middle of their squares. So really like Ted's behavior is just an individualized version of what was actually institutional behavior only 100, 200, 300 years ago and went on for like 400 years, right? 400 or 500 years.
You're talking about like witch trials?
Yeah, exactly. So you see that like in the collective unconscious is actually quite powerful. What's leaking into Ted's experience? Do you see what I'm saying? And that's not intergenerational just for him. You know what I mean? That's not... I don't think that's a lot more than intergenerational. There's something that he's accessing that's like a much wider field than that.
Well, I mean, what that does, that makes me very either or both humble and uncomfortable because I'm part of that same body, and it's sort of like there, but for the grace of something, go like I have all that in me too. Right?
Oh yeah. And and I think it works a little bit like some people are, like you probably know this, like one part of our body can be seemingly healthy and another part may not be and corroding, right? All at the same time. And it takes a while for us to really recognize the corroded parts often, right? We're like, oh, I get a shoulder pain once in a while, but people don't realize it's inflammation in the liver. And that means you're having gut dysbiosis, but they're dissociated. So they don't realize till like 40 years in. And they're like, oh, why am I developing this autoimmune condition? But they don't realize it's connected to their shoulder pain from like 30 years ago, right? It's very similar to that. Yeah. So, and because we have a way of thinking about ourselves as individuals. So yeah, exactly. Like for some grace that you're like, oh, I'm mostly okay here. Like I don't have that kind of instinct but that doesn't mean other parts of the cultural soma don't. If that makes sense.
Yeah. So I'm trying to sort of parse something that let's say like there's my culture. That like all the the stuff that we're doing and all that. And then there's how I, as a member of that culture, am perceived by the wider world. Like I'm thinking about some of the work of Ibram Kendi, where he argues that anytime there's two groups, that there's a difference in outcome in two groups, it's because the group with the better outcome is oppressing the group with the with the lesser outcome. So right.
I guess I don't know how to agree or disagree with that
right.
statement.
Well, so the other argument is that, well, let's say there's, he's arguing against a narrative of the Black community that well, there's a culture that wherever it came from of less than, less achievement or like hopelessness or,
right.
And so like, how do you think about whether whatever I'm experiencing comes from like inside my culture or whether it's because of the way I'm oppressed by the wider culture?
Okay.
And does that question even make sense, or do you want to reframe it completely? Or...
No, it doesn't. It doesn't make sense actually. But I mean, like I really struggle honestly with like, yeah, I struggle. So when it's not given a neurological frame, I struggle a bit.
Yeah. So if my question doesn't make sense, do you have a sense of what I'm missing or where I'm confused?
Oh, I mean, I'm gonna tell you where you're confused because I think you're probably pretty certain about what you're saying. I'm just having trouble putting I get a bit dyslexic with ideas too, and like flipping my head. Like, what did you mean by the?
Okay.
It's more like, it sounds a bit like, what's being said is like, the results of an in-group are a lot of the times the effects of the relationship with an out-group.
Let me try. Yeah, so let's
maybe that failed.
Well, let me see if because I'm not even all right. So let me try something. So if we talk about like white Protestant patriarchal culture in America, like nobody's oppressed them, and
yeah, that's not true. But yeah, sure.
No, it's not.
No, it's totally not true. Yeah.
Okay, beautiful.
Yeah. But I understand what you mean, though.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, like, you wrote a really powerful piece. I think it went pretty viral about like white people can't dance.
Oh yeah.
Right. And white. It wasn't. You weren't saying that the struggles that white people have to dance, by which you mean a whole bunch of things.
Yeah,
it's not because Black people or brown people or anyone is oppressing them. It's something that has become interjected into white culture.
Yeah, sure. I mean, yeah, absolutely. Mm-hmm.
So you're saying that comes from trauma?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
All right, so help me follow that back. Where does that trauma come from?
Okay. Well, okay. So let me see. I'm gonna do a little flipping the attention. So invite us to like maybe do a bit of grounding as we talked about.
Beautiful.
So inviting you to take a gentle breath in, just natural breath, right? Oh yeah, and if you're driving, don't do this. I hope you realize that. And then dropping your breath lower into your body very gently. So you're kind of letting gravity breathe for you. And in a very non-verbal way now. Like you're not going to use words or maybe even images, just very like intuitively connecting to the land that you're on. And just notice there's some kind of two-way communication there. You're at a loss for words. And if you don't believe in this stuff, you can just imagine that it's happening. That's okay. That's fine. It doesn't really matter. The point is, what it does for your nervous system is the key thing. If you notice you're becoming calmer, more gentle, more settled, that's something. So results are everything. Okay. All right, and you're probably starting to notice some physiological change, heart rate, blood flow. You're probably recovering some sensation in your lower body and stuff.
Thank you.
So this is a grand story. Where might we start this grand story?
Well, I mean, one of the things I have been struggling with is the concept of white fragility, which I think you have.
Actually, you know what? I'm going to interrupt that. I'm going to
Good,
interrupt that.
good.
Say, like, I don't know. I feel like we're going in a different. I'm going in a different direction.
Okay,
now.
good. I'll follow
But it
you.
might answer everything. You know what I mean? So, you know, if people are familiar with every land that humans have been on, there's usually kind of gods or spirits associated with that land. Does that copy to? I wonder if that copies to people. Gods that are very specific to the place, very specific to place. You know what I mean? And so you can consider that like spiritually, it's like the local mom and pop store, right? So the spirits and gods that are recognized have an impact, but only really on the community that they're a part of immediately, right? And so from there's been a transition to, let's say, a Starbucks coming in, right? Like spiritually. So you have like a god from another place come into another place, right? And often that's going to take the shape of like a sun god or a sky god or some, like a little bit. So, you know, when you think about it this way, like when you start getting into sky and stuff, you start to get into universality. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Because there's a horizon. Because you're going to lose your god if you walk out too far out of your territory. Your god's gone.
Right.
The god you're connected to the sky, all it's fucking everywhere. So you get to keep going, or the sun, you get to keep going, right? So it's kind of interesting to think about, right? And where are you anchored? So that's like kind of like you're starting to move into a more franchise model, right? And a lot of what is called imperial expansion is just that, right? So this movement towards this kind of like juxtaposition, I think, is really important to understand. That, like, you know, in the history of people that we call you know, WASP, or, you know, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, behind that kind of like Starbucks god, which is essentially Christendom within you know, Christendom in the most recent histories of Western Europe, is such like that. It's like a Starbucks. It's like a chain store, chain at Walmart type outlet that's taken over the precedent of something that was a local shop. Does that make sense?
Yeah, completely.
Yeah. And I think for Jewish people, it's pretty interesting because there's so much displacement within Jewish people, right?
Yeah, we had the horse-drawn cart of.
Right. Yeah. So so I think Jewish people are particularly interesting in this, and how you know, the Abrahamic religions come out, you know, of those traditions and stuff. But specifically just talking about Western Europe, there was a displacement of those local gods, and that means that in the collective consciousness, the market share of the collective consciousness changed, right? And so when we say that, like, there isn't oppression, it's more like, well, like, what is, you know, there's that's something to think about, if that makes sense.
Well, so I mean, at the level at which an individual had to give up their local mom and pop god.
Yeah.
Like, it's different if they keep walking and they're like, holy cow, like maybe the sun is the thing, versus being conquered and and either enslaved or incorporated into a larger system in which they don't have the same agency.
Right, but I mean, how there's I think the point is that like the way people usually lose their relationship to whatever is regional is usually through conquest
Mm-hmm.
of some kind, right? Like yeah, like these nation states are created through something.
Mm-hmm.
That didn't exist before. There's like conquest and stuff that happened that allow that to happen, right? And so there's a lot of undigested material from that, I think, that we're dealing with now, which is really what I'm saying is that like I'm not talking about the last 500 years, although maybe I am talking about the last 500 years, but like this is the thing. Yeah.
So what are some examples of that undigested material?
Let's see. Hmm. Yeah, I mean, like what is tend to be called. I don't know if that's the route I want to go. Let me see. Did you edit this?
I can, yeah.
Okay, I'm just trying to think. I'm just like pausing myself.
Uh-huh.
Uh-huh. Okay, so I'm going to go to another desperate place.
Okay.
So a lot of the work that you do is probably about digestion, right?
Yeah, actually it is.
Yeah, yeah. So we can talk about that, about diet, microbiomes and stuff.
Sure.
So I don't know. Where does that take? Where does that take you?
Well, the first thing is that there's foods that human beings have evolved or been designed to eat,
Yeah.
and it's hard to get them these days.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And even the ones that are the most natural didn't exist 2,000, 3,000 years ago.
Right, right, right. Yeah, yeah.
Most of us think that what we're eating now is perfectly normal. We can't imagine changing to anything else.
Sure. Yeah, yeah.
Where we can get very addicted to it because it provides a lot of dopamine in the moment, and it's killing us.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So I think this is like a very difficult, like I think a lot of what your work is dealing with is dealing with that indigestion of thousands of years of human history,
Hmm.
but trying to figure a way out of it, right? Do you know what I mean?
So I understand the outline of the metaphor.
Yeah, yeah.
So like is the sort of the witches and Ted Bundy, that's an example.
Right, right.
Like is it basically the narrative that my group did terrible things that I have to deal with, or terrible things were done to my group that I'm still dealing with, or is that a false dichotomy?
Yeah, I think it's a false dichotomy.
Okay. Good, because I just want to say, like,
Yeah. I'm just trying to hang out in this like weird place right now. I
yeah.
hope
Well,
you understand.
I'm finding it very challenging because this is not a conversation where I sort of know where I want to go,
Right, right.
and I'm again I'm like stumbling around hitting my shins against
Yeah.
table legs trying to find a light switch. So I'm kind of enjoying my own
Yeah.
confusion and discomfort, and I trust that something
Yeah.
good will come of it.
Well, like something I talked to somebody about like we can even get outside of plant-based because I think that's like a niche thing and talk more like largely about digestion food,
Sure.
like, I was talking to somebody and so like insecticide, right? Like people love, Japanese people love white rice, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we know that white rice is not as good for you as brown rice. Let's just put it that way. We know that. Let's just put that out there as like a comment. I eat white rice, but I mix some multigrain with it. That's how I deal with it. But um, brown rice is a whole grain and all that. It's wonderful. So where's the where does the insecticide come in? Well, brown rice was for poor people, or I mean, poor people didn't even get to eat rice, but brown rice is less aristocratic than white rice, right? Because white rice is like has a dopamine hit, it's sugary, it's refined, right? Goes along well with like certain flavors and stuff like that. And brown rice was for poor people, and now brown rice is more expensive than white rice because of insecticide, right? So the insecticide is allowed for a larger population of people to indulge in like what was originally kind of an aristocratic behavior, right? Aristocratic dietary choice. But it's actually corroding people's digestion overall compared to, let's say, eating brown rice. It's like better for your microbial environment, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's like a pretty big nutshell of what we're dealing with right now. If you want to talk about cultural trauma and history and how we inherit it, right? It's in our lifestyle, right? So we're dealing with all that. We're dealing with, yeah. So why did Europeans, consume so much sugar? Why did sugar becoming what was originally an aristocratic thing, becoming commonly available to the commoner? What does that serve in as luxury, And think about like why, and we know the sugar gives you a dopamine hit, right?
Right.
You know that really well. What does that mean when you look at the history of Europe and it's just like bloodshed? I mean, so is Asia, but like it's just bloodshed. The history of medieval history is just like pillaging and killing for hundreds of years, like civilians being slaughtered. So what is that? People inheriting that trauma, why would they want dopamine? You know what I mean?
Uh-huh.
So then I feel like you're trying to get this. You know what I mean? It's talking about kind of like this is a very large scaffolding in our in our lifestyle is actually mechanisms that we've created to deal with this massive intergenerational trauma that's still in our collective unconscious in a huge way. So that like white kid that shot up those protesters, is he separate from like a sugary icing kind of like fluffy cake from a supermarket? You know what I'm talking about? Like it's kind of like gross.
Well, I mean, for me, it's mapping onto when I work with someone who has any sort of either addiction or binge behavior for a particular type of food. The central challenge is always going to be, can you feel what you're feeling that makes you want to not feel it with this food? Right. So the dopamine is always like, why do you, I imagine the work of Gabor Mate. He's your neighbor, I guess, right?
Yeah, I've never met him.
In Vancouver.
Out on a walk or anything, but yeah. I know exactly.
But like, what he asks addicts is like, how is this addiction good for you? Like, what is it doing for you positively? And so for the individuals I work with, they have pain in their lives, and dopamine, the quick dopamine hit that they get from junk food, is an immediate self-reinforcing salve. And so you're saying that's not so beyond the individual. There's an entire culture of pain that, when sugar was available, immediately was 100%. Utilized to address.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
There's a lot of our lifestyle decisions, and particularly maybe food is an interesting one to look at, is that as a result of that kind of dealing with that, imperialism worldwide. right? And this isn't just like white people are bad because you're like the if you look at, I've been taking more hard look at the history of like what we call the Middle East and then Eurasia and all that. You see, it's just a massive clusterfuck of like imperialism, and people are killing each other, and it's like, a lot of white people died at the hands of people of color. Like it's pretty obvious, right? Like the Mongols went really far. The Ottomans got really far, and then of course, like, the Crusades, waged in so there's a lot more than just this current conversation that we're having that we need to take account of. And of course, like what we see now are like what happens to a world when certain people have won more recently, you know what I mean, in the last 500 years or so. But there's a much longer history to account for, I think. It's very important for us to understand.
Okay. So when I think about sugar geopolitically, I think about slavery.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
And yet
absolutely.
the way you're framing it, and the story of slavery,
Mm-hmm.
from my enlightened progressive perspective, is that
Yeah,
Europeans were the bad guys, and they were at fault, and they were wrong, and they enslaved lots of people of color. And of
yeah,
course, at some level, that's true, and it also doesn't take into account what you're talking about of the trauma of individuals losing their mom and pop gods and becoming like
yeah.
there's no way to there's nowhere to stick the flag of blame
Well,
in this.
yeah, I mean, yeah, it's harder too. I think there's responsibility, but it's more like, I think people tend to forget that, like, so let's say, like, because I've been really paying attention to this more, like, when a land gets imperialized, often the people that are there get enslaved to become join armies and stuff like that, and have to go and fight overseas. You know what I mean? Like, people are having to do things against their will for a very long time, and that's built up. So, like, I think it's an assumption. It would be very assumptive, yeah, to say it's that flat. Like, you're gonna have a lot of people, let's say, probably white people who are really poor, who participate in the slave trade, but they didn't necessarily have a say about it. They're pretty much slaves themselves, probably. Like, you know what I mean? Um, like, yeah, and for warlords and stuff, this is just, and merchants, like, this is how a lot of it's working. And so, like, I think there's individual responsibility, and then there's also the reality that, like, the Industrial Revolution and uh, has benefited greatly a certain type of person, and it's disproportionately benefited white people. That's true. You know what I mean? Because white people had been the winners of the last 500 years. So, yeah,
So,
so that
so
is something
yeah.
that's huge, but
So
it's just
yeah.
now. Yeah,
So if we
yeah,
look at history in terms of, okay,
mm,
there was this conquest slash discovery, there was a
mm,
new invention, there was a new means of production, and it's caused all this pain among
mm.
the losers. Are we saying that basically progress equals trauma? That, like, if you could push a button, would we go back to hunter-gatherer tribes worshiping local gods?
Yeah. I mean, I think yeah. I don't think we can do that. No, this gets into a lot more complexity, but yeah, progress equals trauma. I think it's like kind of like maturation. And that's not to say like everything that happened is being collateral damage or anything. That's like not what I'm saying. It's like, hmm. And there's a part of me that, yeah, like I could accept that human history had to evolve in a certain way. And I don't think our plan is to go back to the past or anything like that. But what we definitely need to do is have some kind of integration so we're not over relying on these coping skills that we've gathered. And, and like white supremacy is a coping skill. It's like a coping mechanism, right? Privilege is a coping mechanism.
So can you say more about that? Because that feels very theoretical to me.
Right, right,
which
right.
means that I'm probably
Right, right,
I'm
right.
probably really good at it.
Well, so you know how like, acquiring a sugar by European powers is like a psychological coping mechanism for the collective trauma that Europeans experienced in the medieval times, right?
Okay.
And before that, right? So following that, it's like the privilege to have sugar, be able to eat cake, following Marie Antoinette, let them eat cake. Being able to eat cake. This is like this is a privilege that has developed. But what that privilege allows us to do, just like how when we have like dependent eating behaviors to soothe a pain that we don't perceive, it's very similar. Like
Hmm.
people have comfort in their life with that we call privilege now, that allows them to circumvent the pain underneath. But the pain is there because it's in the digestion, it's in the body, it's an intergenerational body, it's being inherited, right? Like all the gut dysbiosis and all the other autoimmune stuff that people experience now, that's all intergenerational trauma. So it's there. It's just we hide it very well. We're trying to run away from it.
Uh-huh.
Right? So, but it's catching up to us. So that's kind of how I understand it.
Gotcha. Wow. So what do I mean what yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, when I see a client or someone I might be a client who is 400 pounds
Mhm.
and they've soothed themselves with sugar, with fat, with white
Right.
flour, with all that stuff, and I can see they might think they're jolly and happy in the life of the party, but easy for me to see the pain underneath. It's very easy for me not to judge that person, and to feel compassion. And in fact,
Sure.
one of the things that I've gotten good at doing is I'll see people like that at like Costco or Walmart, and
Hmm.
I'll picture their healthy selves, like their
Sure.
best self. But when I see a group of people protesting in Charlottesville, or like in my state, there's a whole
Hmm.
right wing reopen everything, praise
Sure.
God, right wing, like
Mhm.
it's very, or even worse when I see or hear people being overtly racist.
Sure.
I don't have the same inclination to understand them, to see their pain, to want to help them. And part of it, I
Hmm.
think, is on social media, that if I even say like, oh well, like like the whole thing is, oh, the white kid shot up a church, he has mental problems. Black people are protesting in the streets, they're naturally violent, right? So
Right.
even to
Sure.
go to this idea of trauma feels like
Hmm.
in our current culture that it gets fucked with, oh, you're excusing that behavior, and my left-wing friends won't like that.
Hmm. 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 I think you're mentioning something pretty interesting. So I'm sitting with kind of how to parse it out.
Okay.
Because I feel like the question that you're bringing up is a lot more um, about how are we responsible for our trauma, right?
I think that as I'm listening to myself, and I so appreciate the
Hmm.
silence that you're allowing. I feel like
Hmm.
not editing any of it out, just
Okay,
because
sure.
it's organic. What I'm really saying is like I see myself as a healer,
Sure.
and I see a sick society, and there are these blockages to me being a healer. Like I have to, like the desire to be right, the desire to tell other people they're wrong, the desire to avenge is completely
Hmm.
blocking any healing that I might offer. And I
Hmm.
know how to work with individuals when they come to me, And I don't seem to be able to access this innate healing tendency, which I feel is my gift to the world. Like something in the way I'm thinking about it is messed up.
Well, let's take that away from you. I don't know if it's something in the way that you think is messed up or anything, but like what I think you're coming back to is that what are people responsible for taking care of in terms of themselves, right? Like, and we have a weird relationship to trauma. Like I think it's reasonable for us to say that we are responsible for the trauma in our body and healing that. Individually, we are each responsible for that. And if that was the premise of like how our conversations change, because I'm going to reroute to, let's say, like when you're talking about, somebody who's really fat, and I'm going to put it out there. I think there's a lot of complex conversations around fat shaming and obesity and health and stuff. And I don't know how to perfectly navigate it. But one place where I'll go to is that regardless of how we are shaped, right? You could be really thin, you could be really fat, you could be really muscular, you could be really not muscular, whatever. Our bodies are a reflection of the relationships that we're in and how we're doing them, right? I think one of the problems that we have in our culture is that we tend to highlight certain body responses to trauma and not others. So let's say like being very muscular, which actually can be a trauma response for obvious reasons, because your body's in constant fight response. So you're trying to, armorize and all this, right? A lot of culture around hyper masculinity is like applauded versus, let's say, like if your body's response to trauma is to gain weight or gain fat weight, you probably are shaming one thing and upholding the other, but they're actually, depending on looking at the person, they're both traumatic responses. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
And so there's no need to shame either in a way. And there's also a need to maybe actually have a responsible conversation about any of those responses in like a very real way, in a very non-judgmental way. That's kind of like where I try to navigate. But this is definitely like a tough question, because I do believe there's some people are, as much as some people are naturally muscular and healthy with that, I'm sure there's people who are naturally fat and are healthy with that. Like, I know that, but that doesn't mean every person is fat is having a well response to the world. And then also there's the reality that all of us are probably in some kind of traumatic response, regardless of our shape. Like being very thin can be a traumatic response, right? Like there can actually be inflammation responses and all kinds of things underneath that. So I think there's something about reorienting that conversation, though, pivoting it around, like what are our responsibilities for working with intergenerational trauma, or the trauma in our bodies and the cultural traumas that are around us when we inherit or that we express, and how without any expectation, how do we change when we get, like, instead of maybe like pivoting it around the results that we're trying to aim for, is to actually more work from the place of like when we get into a better state of well-being, that might be they might actually look a little bit individually different, but what happens naturally unfolding from a person being in a better state of being. And I think when we center that a lot more, we have different results. And this goes into talking a bit like on like a white kid who shot up and a bunch of people, and they're white supremacy and stuff. And if you say it's trauma, are we coddling them? It's like, well, if you assume that we're not responsible for our trauma, I guess saying that somebody has trauma is going to be like problematic, right? Because you're letting them off the hook.
Mm-hmm.
But that's based on a social order where we're not responsible for a trauma. You know what I mean? That's based on this assumption that we're not responsible for healing our stuff. You know, that we don't have a collective responsibility to do so.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that there's something a little bit. Yeah, I don't think it's something that you're thinking wrong. I think it's something that's actually kind of a bit fucked up about of what we live in, is that we don't actually. That's not actually like a foundation of how we do things. Is that, oh, we actually each have a self responsibility to heal ourselves, and we also each have a responsibility to the collective to support other people in doing that.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So these are the things that are like just kind of I think messed up. Yeah.
Yeah. And you know, when you're talking about sort of muscular people can be just as trauma informed as obese people.
Right.
So
Sure.
there's lots of ways in which I look like a functional, healthy person to the outside that are actually manifestations of trauma.
Oh yeah, totally.
Right. I just happen to have gotten lucky in that my trauma is socially applauded.
Yeah, I think that's kind of what I'm saying. Yeah, because you have like people who are, you have people who are really muscular and that's seen as healthy or something, whatever, muscular and lean, and then you actually talk to them and you're like, oh, you can't actually sense your abdominal movements. They have gut dysbiosis, they have inflammation inside, like, but it's all armored and you can't see it, right? And you're like, well, I mean, it's like, but we have this weird way in our culture about privilege certain things and not others. So that, yeah, I think that's very real, very, very real.
So is the solution or approach the Gandhi line to just be the change? Like we just work on our own shit?
Yeah, yeah. I think actually really practical is to work on your microbiome. I actually like to be very pragmatic about that. It's like, yeah, that's work on your own shit, I guess. Like quite literally, work on your digestion. Seriously. Yeah, work on inflammation and microbial environment. And and when in regaining that, there's everything comes out of it. Like how you because I don't know, regaining your microbiome environment is very emotional, like stirring. A lot of shit comes up. You know what I mean? Because it's the
well, for me, I can tie my microbiome to individual childhood trauma, right? To being
right.
to be cesarean birth, and to being
Right.
formula bottle fed.
Right. So
Like
yeah,
I think of
yeah,
those
exactly.
typically as physiological, limitations and shortcomings, but there, of course, there was also an emotional,
Right.
spiritual aspect to each of those
Exactly.
things that I missed out on.
Yeah, and then there's the cultural, right? Like
So,
why, cesareans are often a result of, you know, people losing sensation in their pelvic muscles and stuff, right? And getting constricted there. And that has a lot to do with their lifestyle, sitting on chairs a lot. And where does that come from? That comes from imperialism, Same with being growing up on formula. What are that's totally the Industrial Revolution behind that, right? So, and the lifestyle changes that came with that, right? And that's a result of imperialism. You're gonna, you know what I mean? Like, so all those individual things you experience are actually cultural phenomena that your entire family network is a part of, right? And so when we, like if you probably weren't working on your microbiome, we wouldn't be having this conversation. You know what I mean? So I think this is very foundational, actually.
and is the idea of the microbiome being so central a sort of like self-similarity chaos theory thing? Like I am the body, like the microbiome is all these trillions of entities, and just like I'm nested, and like this is the universe that I can take responsibility for.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, this is the microcosm that I can really try to take responsibility for and see the results of immediately,
Mm.
you know. And then when your microbiome changes, your posture changes, you know. And so when your posture changes, the way you interact with the world changes. And whatever body we manifest from that change is like something that we might appreciate, you know. Maybe not
Mm.
uphold, like pedestalize, but appreciate its emergence, as opposed to, let's say, like, because I think a lot, you know, we tend to go for like, I don't want to be fat, or you know what I mean, or I want to put on more muscle, or like we have a destination in mind.
Hmm.
That So that's like the top-down approach. Right? The bottom-up approach would be like, well, my microbial condition inside my body sucks. I want to fix it. And I'm going to see what happens as I fix this thing that I don't know what the effects of that are going to be. Some
Mm.
people might gain weight. Some people might lose. You know, it's like really individual. A lot of people are probably going to break up with their partners and make new friends.
Yeah. Well, one thing I read recently was that our microbiomes are taking a hit in the quarantining because
Huh.
we're coming into contact with fewer other human organisms.
Oh, yeah, yeah. No, that's an interesting question. Well, yeah, yeah. I mean, that gets into like I think that gets into like I don't know. Is that what we want to end our conversation with though today?
No, but when you
No,
think
because
about like
there's
where the microbiome can be enriched in things like the dirt,
yeah, yeah,
right? Like
yeah,
you had me like sensing the land.
yeah, yeah,
Right,
yeah, yeah.
right.
Right.
I'm on a a concrete slab on my office here, but I can go outside in bare feet and walk on grass and pick up dirt and smell
Yeah,
geosmins from the pines in my front yard.
yeah.
Like there's something about. I mean, one thing I love about that, like the microbiome can save us, is that it's in a sense it's greater than human. Like we're
Oh,
looking for help from something greater than the human world.
right, right. Well, I would, I would say like those local gods, the microbiome is a great description of that, right? Because we're all essentially fermenting beings, right? And the ferments change their flavor and texture and stuff. You know, if you're a whiskey drinker, you know what I mean, you know this. Depending on where the land is and the climate and the flora and the fauna, the flavor of the actual drink changes, right?
Hmm.
So we are that, and I would argue actually with the pandemic, really like the pandemic is really supposed to be something that gives us more time to regenerate our microbiome. I would say,
Mm.
because that's like to regenerate our microbiome, we require rest. We require parasympathetic nervous system activation. We require rest and digest. This whole thing of like, the whole thing that we've been doing is like, I'm having a cold, but I'm going into work. Well, like this pandemic is basically showing how fucked up that's going to be. You know what I mean? So the message really is to stay home and eat dirt.
Uh-huh.
And the poverty in our thinking is that we don't do that, maybe is that we want to be fine again, we want to be okay again,
Mm.
but you know
Yeah, well,
yeah,
that's me taking a an aspirin to drop my fever so that my perception of illness goes away before the illness actually does.
yeah, exactly. So yeah, so I think covid is actually a very benign illness in a lot of ways, even though like we're destined to survive it. Our economy may not,
Mm.
or our humanity may not. um, our economy actually needs to go with probably, with COVID. But you know what I mean? COVID is very benign, and we're destined to survive it.
Mm. You
As
mean
a, you know
benign
what I mean?
on a global scale?
Yeah, like it's not the Spanish flu and it's not the plague. We're not going to lose 25% of our population year over year. You know what I mean? Like that's not what it is. Like, like we just have to get realistic with that. It's what it's doing and um, but what it does, it prevents us from being productive. But I think it's actually, if you listen to it, it's in a very good way. You know what I mean? When you have a cold, you're supposed to rest, just chill out, do nothing, unplug.
Mm.
And we have a whole economy that doesn't allow us to do that. And so that might be what kills us.
Hmm.
The economy might kill us. How we've been running might kill us. Like our beliefs around who we're supposed to be might kill us. But the illness is pretty benign, actually, really. And when I'm saying that in a big sense, like of course I know people, like I know people who've lost people, like that's very real. But when you look at the overall landscape, it's benign compared to what a pandemic actually generally is, which is like 25 to 30% maybe even fatality.
Right.
And
So
and even
the thing that is exacerbating everything in terms of human suffering is our unwillingness to respond appropriately.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that's a very good way to encapsulate a conversation. It's our inability. Yeah, very much so.
All right. Well, I think I'm starting to wrap my head around.
We
So,
can have a part two. We can have a part two.
okay.
Yeah, I think we like traveled around quite a bit. But yeah, I don't know. I wonder. I hope that people got a bit of like a sense of what cultural somatics is about. It's very like it's like kind of like what would I leave it with? Like, so at least in my approach, like so I think generally speaking, let's say, um, I'm obviously an anti-racist person. I would consider myself, I guess some people would say, like, some people might say I'm an anti-racist activist, but my kind of thinking goes to, like, the problem of racism, for example, or misogyny or whatever, is not necessarily solved by a singular issue approach of anti-racism or anti-misogyny. That's not actually what it is. Um, like a better, like a not better, but I guess maybe I think it's better, and maybe a more whole approach, let's say, to racism, might be like, oh, well, what does microbial restoration look like? That might actually be. It's kind of like the problem is not necessarily entirely the solution. Like kind of like in the same ways that like if you have a headache, Advil isn't like the singular solution to migraine. You know what I mean? There's a whole other system of things underneath a migraine that need to be looked at, right? Probably microbial, frankly. I mean, when you get down to it, it's probably going to end up back in your microbial stuff and all your pelvic muscles and all that stuff, right? That's where the migraine stuff comes from, through your up spine and how your digestion system and your posture interact. So, the solution to racism might not be anti-racism. Like it could be, it's like a part of it, but it's not what it's like it has to include a lot more than that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does, because that when I first discovered the anti-racism work, which was about a year ago, so I'm so proud of myself for not having been the person who suddenly started buying these books. Like I was like a few months early, like yay
Okay.
me.
Yeah, or you're a early majority or something like that.
Right, and there was and there's a way in which at first I totally embraced the self-flagellation.
Yeah.
And then I started not. When I applied my coaching hat to it, like this idea that now Robin DiAngelo is the most popular author in America, and it's basically white people reading about how essentially she's like her solution when if someone says, okay, I read your book, what should I do? Her answer is, well, the first question you have to ask yourself is, how come you haven't done anything up till now?
Really?
Yeah,
I don't know.
I've heard her say that 4 or 5 times on podcasts and in lectures. And I'm like, boy, as a coach, that's exactly the wrong thing.
That's interesting.
Right.
Yeah.
So to help, people.
As a coach, that would be a very cult-like abusive thing to say. Oh, right? No, seriously.
Yeah, I mean, I just thought it would be extremely unhelpful to get people.
Yeah, I would think it is in a coaching frame that would be abusive. Not saying that she's just talking problem on TV. So, but it's interesting to think about that because I think that is an abusive thing to say. Like if a client came to me and my first response is like, well, why haven't you come to me before? You're getting into abuse.
Yeah.
To be honest, an abusive dynamic. Yeah. So
Say
that's
more. I'm
interesting.
not sure I totally understand that. I'm agreeing with you because I think you're right, but I don't know that I couldn't explain it to someone else. What is abusive about that?
Well, I mean, because I can divorce this from like Robin being abusive. I mean, I mean, I don't really care. I don't know her work well enough, so it doesn't really matter that much to me. But the if you as a as a coach, um, and the person's like, instead of being like, oh, you're here now, let's work with this present moment, you're dragging them into their past response.
Hmm.
I would say that's abusive.
Okay, gotcha.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, it's like, I think the right answer there that's pretty obvious to me is like, well, you're here right now. How does your body sense? Let's bring you into the present moment.
Hmm.
We're not like shooting into you're like, okay, well, you're responsible. Like, that doesn't, yeah. So
Yeah.
I think you're really right, but that's interesting. Yeah,
Yeah. I
sure.
mean, I would
Yeah,
say something like, great. So what's different now?
yeah.
What's
That's total.
right?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Um,
Absolutely.
so given that, so if white supremacy and white
Hmm.
fragility are both responses to trauma or symptoms of trauma, then I think going the other way to sort of
Hmm.
this white guilt
Hmm.
seems to me, in the way that I embraced it for a while, also felt like a response to trauma.
Yeah, probably. Yeah. Yeah, most of the time, people, that's what we go through. Yeah, some hypersensitization process. That's trauma driven, mostly because I guess I'll just say that a lot of the people writing about this stuff are not writing from the standpoint of somebody who's well seasoned as a person who works at trauma, right?
Hmm.
So of course it's gonna like, like a lot of the material that's written and people consume is not trauma safe or trauma informed. I don't love the word trauma safe, but it's like it's not coming from a neurological lens. Like it's
Hmm.
not coming from a somatic. It's not coming from like the lens of what is an ethical approach to change or anything like that. That's not what it's centered around, right?
Hmm.
In the in our kind of works context. So that's totally, yeah, I think that's totally reasonable. Um, I think it's our work to then be able to take in this information and be like, okay, have a little bit of a gut, coming back to this, have a microbial sense of wellness that we can actually filter, digest the material, and go like, I like this part, I'm not taking this in. I like this part. But a lot of what happens is when people are working around, they're like, if you're a white person or you're a man and you're dealing with your race or gender stuff, we have a tendency to come in like, oh, this is the place where I'm really bad. So you come in with a totally collapsed sense of being,
Hmm.
and then you have no ability to digest the material on your own terms. And yeah, so that when I find that that can lend itself to definitely to problematic and abusive dynamics for sure, 100%. But I do think there is like, you know, at the same time, like, we have to think about it because people are making money off that too, right? Like racial justice and gender justice is a big industry now. Frankly, like my traffic on my website has exploded like 3 to 4 times that before, and I'm sure Robin is really famous now, and there's lots of other people who have been doing racial justice work that I've gotten a lot more exposure, and a lot more money is flowing into their coffers, and I'm not a person who's against making money or anything like that. I love it, so I'm not saying that's necessarily bad or anything, but it's worth like examining like how is our industry operating? Is it ethical what we're doing? I think that's worth the conversation.
Hmm.
Yeah. And
Gotcha.
something I'm very stern about, as you can probably see.
Uh-huh.
Uh, but yeah, like, so, I do believe it's up to, it's kind of like, on my part, like, actually, when I work with white people, it's the first thing I do is like try to be like, okay, so what's your ability? I don't really care about right away whether being racist or not about X thing. Like you're coming to me, you're probably, I'm not trying to like, I'm not going in, why haven't you come to me before? It's like, okay, well, you're trying to do something now
Yeah.
with your stuff. And the first thing I work on is not about how do you know if you're doing something racist or not? It's not that actually. The first thing I generally work on, I try to work on, and this is not a promoting myself, but maybe it is. Sorry, maybe I'm promoting myself.
Well,
But
you
but it's to
you
say like I get to do
I
that.
would hope so.
Okay, okay.
You've just given me 80 minutes of your time. I hope you get
All right,
something
right,
out
right,
of it.
right, right. Well, something I think is really healthy is actually to first build up the person's capacity to digest their own material and be responsible for their own systems in that way. You know what I mean? And not like they don't have to like ingest everything I'm saying. They don't have to take everything, because the first thing often when people go and do anti-racist work is figure out all the ways that they can be anti-racist. And it's like I actually find the starting place that I find more better results in is actually to first start with how are your family patterns involved in this? Actually, the early childhood patterns are very important. And it's like, how do you respond to new information and digest it? Let's set you up with a process that you can get some embodied sense of this is good, this is bad, this is me in process, right? And because actually, if you don't have that, you can interact with anything and it can become cult-like abusive dynamic with interacting with anything. But it is also, on the other hand, if you have the ability to digest material, it doesn't have to be perfect coming in, because nothing out there is really that perfect, including my work, then you have the capacity to go, I'm going to take this part of me, this work in, and then poop out the rest. Right? So the digestion part is actually, like, this is the whole thing I'm saying is like, the solution to racism is not necessarily anti-racism. It might be just, the foundation might be microbial health. And I mean that quite literally.
Well, I mean, what this is reminding me of is like one of the things that has bothered me is like the way people are taking in or not taking in new information about the virus. Like it's become right. Like you're on this side or that side. If there's a study that suggests herd immunity in Sweden or New York and you mention it, then you're obviously, anti-mask and you want everyone to die. Or if you're, if you're waiting for a vaccine because nothing else is going to get us out of lockdown, then you're anti-nat. And like I'm seeing, like when you put it that way, our ability, our varied abilities to digest new information. So, I guess sort of an intellectual, a cognitive microbiome, which is grounded in our physical gut microbiome.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's the nervous system, right? That's literally the nervous system is that. Yeah, it's the bridge between the physical and the kind of abstract. Yeah.
Right.
So yeah, it's right in there. Yeah. And that's what will kill us or help us survive, you know what I mean? Or even thrive even. Like it's and I think that's a great place to end because I think that's exactly what cultural somatics to me is about seeing that like very kind of like fractal picture of the micro and the macro and the nervous system's role in navigating these very what we call complex planetary issues. It's right in all the answers are in our own nervous systems, and once we get to know the culture in our own bodies, we get to really understand how culture and larger bodies work and what we need to do to actually bring our entire existence, human existence, biosphere existence into better being. Yeah.
Ooh, I love that so much. Yeah. So I have one more question for you, which is
sure.
I like to end with this question. Is there any music that you're listening to that you think people might not know about and would benefit from hearing?
Oh God, music, huh? Okay, hold on. Let me open my Spotify. I'm not gonna play anything. I'm just gonna see music. Why music?
I've just started. My life got better when I started asking people, "Tell me something you listen to that I haven't heard of."
Okay, but what have you heard?
I mean, all sorts of. I'm learning about sort of French hip hop and.
Oh, really? Like Les Nubians? Les Nubians, MC Solar. Okay.
Yeah, and I'm discovering salsa, so.
Okay.
So basically increasing my musical microbiome.
All right. Seriously, this is good. Shit, we can be forever. I'm actually like I used to collect records and stuff. Like, I'm not like a total music buff, but, man, there's so much good shit. Okay. And what do you do? Do people play it or
I'll
something? You
I'll
play
I'll
it?
put a link to a YouTube
Oh,
video
okay,
featuring your
okay, okay.
music.
That's cool. All right. Okay, let me get. Ah, can I? Okay, so how many songs do I get?
Oh, well, let's say three. But if you want
Yeah,
to,
no, no, three is good. Three is good. Okay, three allows me to have like a motion. So I know the middle song is Samba de Flora, Samba
uh
de Flora. So the Samba of Flowers of
okay.
Airto, Airto. Do you know Airto?
Oh, I do know Airto. He had.
Sure. Yeah, well, whatever. You'll get
I,
you'll get.
I, I last I heard of last record I have of his was from like '93.
Oh, okay, 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 okay. So this is different. Um, yeah, Samba de Flora is you'll love it.
Oh,
It's quite a song. So, but the first song I'm trying to figure out, it should be like a mid-tempo song. So there's a bit of, it's like the beginning of something, right? So maybe uh, this is pretty pedestrian, but oh no,
you you want to send it to me later? I don't want to give you homework, but I also don't want to put you on the
oh
spot.
no, 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 this is great. Oh man, there's so many. I can have a whole playlist, to be honest. Like this is what I do. Um,
I'll take it.
okay, okay. Fuck. Okay. Ramsey Lewis, Sun Goddess. Do you know
Okay.
those?
Never.
It's
Sun
pretty
God.
pedestrian. It's like everybody has that. But good. That's cool if you don't know it. Ramsey Lewis, Sun Goddess. Yeah.
Okay, got it.
Okay. And then like we need like a come down song. Okay. I think. Sorry, I don't know. This is I love. I always love this.
I'm loving your enthusiasm here and the care in which you're putting into these three
Oh no,
songs.
this is a great. It's like a three-song DJ mix, right? It's like a koan. Then koan. Because okay. So there's a tie here. Well, there's like a three-way actually, even maybe.
Okay, sounds like we have five. We have five altogether.
No, no, we can't do five because we got to do it in three because there's what's this after Samba de Flora? So it's oh, oh man, that's really hard. It's like I'm thinking like Donny Hathaway, "Someday We'll All Be Free."
Okay.
Uh, I mean, you get to choose maybe the last one. You know what I mean? Or like, oh, because I think we talked about. I think just with all the stuff that's going on, this, in terms of racial trauma and stuff, it's just a really potent song. "Someday We'll All Be Free." And then there's but maybe that's too obvious. Maybe okay. You know. And then there's also the Roots version of the Nina Simone classic. Or actually, I don't know if it's Nina Simone, but I wish I knew how to I wish I knew how it would feel to be free. I wish I knew how. Wish I knew how. I mean, these are all very like serious subjects. But it actually, maybe what it's actually, you know what? Okay, I'm gonna say it's actually good to be subtle and our appreciation. Maybe Joe Sample.
Okay.
I'll go Joe Sample. Okay. Sorry, but at least this is all recorded on the podcast so that people can listen to the songs, right?
Right.
And Joe Sample, "In All My Wildest Dreams."
Hmm.
Do you know the song?
I don't. I love the title.
Yeah, it's the it's the original song that Tupac uses for Dear Mama, I think. It's like a
Okay.
yeah, it's very I think it's kind of like, without going into the obvious message of our times or something, these three songs in their instrumental quality speak a lot to the subtle layers of what's really important. So maybe that's how I would frame it, because they're all instrumental. Maybe that's the thing.
Okay. So
Right?
so not getting bogged down in the words.
Yeah, I mean, I think the words are valuable and important, but I think it's just in this, starting out with Sun Goddess and then Samba de Flora. Because I think if we're talking about, anti-racism revolution, there's a whole
Mm.
playlist we can do with like Jill Scott Heron and like, um, you know, there's a whole, you can start off with, yeah, you can, there's a, yeah, there's a whole exploration of really going into protest songs and stuff that we
Mm.
can do.
Uh-huh.
I think we first, I think I chose instrumental songs, so I'm
Yeah.
gonna build the
Well,
playlist around it.
we'll start with the body
Yeah, I'll
and
start with the body. And
with pleasure, right? So
yeah.
if we protest mad, we're not going to be as effective, right?
Well, I mean, I don't know. Like none of the protest songs I choose would be. Well, yeah, there's. I mean,
All right,
we could
let's I'm
we
gonna
could do
come.
protest three too.
Yeah, I'm gonna come back to you for if you're willing for another conversation.
Okay. Well, I mean, I'm gonna put it out there, if people really want to get off, though, they can listen to it's "Fuck the Police" by Jay Dilla.
Okay.
Yeah, this is that's a great song. But yeah, yeah, you caught me in, like, the thing I love. So like I love music. So you caught me in the right thing.
Awesome. Awesome.
Yeah,
Well,
talk about this
so
for
I
hours.
got that. I'll throw those on the show notes. And thank you so much, man. This is such a deep, worthwhile place for me, and I love that all of my confusion brought me back to microbiome and to digestion, to like where I'm rooted as a practitioner. So I appreciate the the journey that you took me on, and the revelation that I have tools.
Awesome. No, I'm glad for that revelation. Yeah, yeah, we all absolutely do, and of course you do, especially as a practitioner. So yeah, thank you for
Mhm.
inviting me, and signing off, I guess.
All right. Thanks so much, Tada.
Thank you, Howard.